Well, it's been an interesting week. You may have watched the news. You may not. I'm not sure that you missed a whole lot. Or maybe you did. There's been quite a lot of chat this week on ministers' discussion forums on social media. Not about Brexit or Mrs. May's government or any of that kind of stuff, but about the fact that at the General Assembly of this year, the church was told to prepare a radical plan to bring back to the Assembly next year a plan that would make everything right. Good luck with that, we all cried. And in fact, depending on whose perspective, as in all of these things, depending on whose perspective you're viewing from, there are those who would say, we're well underway with that and there's a plan to present. And others say, there's no plan at all. So there are similarities between the church and and politics. But for us today, I think one of the questions is two questions. Where have we been and where are we going? And that's really kind of what I want to look at. So in December 2015, we were accepted as a congregation onto the Path of Renewal process. At that time, one of 23 congregations that were involved in the pilot process. There were 24 ministers and 23 congregations, and it was a process that was to run for 3 years. It was a pilot, so we were kind of making it up a little bit as we went. So we had no idea where we were going, really, or what was going to come from it. So this is the end of that 3-year process. The ministers who have been involved over that time gathered together a couple of months ago to reflect and to think back about what we'd learned and how things had gone and things that we can improve for the next lot of congregations that have been taken onto the process. So I want to take this opportunity to look back at some of that and also forward. The Path of Renewal process was based on work by a consultant called William Bridges. And we did this 3 years ago, so you may not remember it. Some of you, I'm sure, will, because you're quite good with all that kind of stuff. But what he said was organizations have different phases of their existence. And every organization has these things. So the first thing is somebody has a dream. You know, you've got this thing, you've always wanted to do it, you've always wanted to make it, you've got this dream. And that's always the first phase. Let's go and do. And then you launch the venture. You set up your business. And maybe it's just you and a pal, or you and a family member, or you on your own, but you've started, you've launched it, and off you go into the big wide world, making or selling or doing whatever it is that you've set out to do. But then there comes a point in any organization where you need to get organized because you've grown a bit, and somebody needs to have responsibility for a specific area, and you begin to give responsibility. But I'm still small enough so that if somebody phones you, for example, and says, I've got this problem, everybody knows how to fix the problem. Because you know enough about the organization still, because you're small enough. And then you make it. So you get to that stage of making it. Things just go berserk. And you're running at 1,000 miles an hour just to keep everything going. You're working 25 hours a day, 8 days a week, just to keep on top of everything. And things have flourished. And then you become an institution. Because everybody has their area of responsibility. And at this stage in an organization, when you phone somebody, you get, oh, I can help you. No, you get, well, that's nothing to do with me. Well, could you put me to the right person? Oh, I don't know. And you get people who have their own area of responsibility and they don't know anything about anything else. And they don't really care much about anything else either, truth be told, because they've got their own targets and their own place, and they know what they're supposed to be doing, and that's when you become an institution. After that, you get closing in. Everybody knows what they're doing. Everybody does what they're supposed to do. And woe betide you if you suggest changing anything. In evidence, I will say the name of a company, and you'll understand. Kodak. Kodak. At one time in history, everybody went to Kodak for their film. And then, becoming the institution, making it and all that kind of stuff, they got a wee bit of competition, but they were still good. And they could still compete against Fujifilm and the likes. And they were right. When the first digital cameras came out, the quality wasn't there. It wasn't good. Film was still better. But at that point, they should have got into digital imaging. At that point, they should have changed, but they were closing in. They closed ranks and said, no, this is what we do. And they weren't in a place to change. And what happened to them? Number 7. They died because they didn't change. But, says Bridges, between stages 6 and 7, there is an alternative. There is a different way. And that was what he called the path of renewal. So from there you can realize that you're in dire straits and you can go back to any one of the previous stages. So you can go back to dreaming the dream, or you can go back to launching a venture, something that's been in your mind. You can go back to all of that and change. And for him, he called that the path of renewal. But some people argued, what's that got to do with the church? Why would we need to change? Well, that's kind of why. When you look at the figures, in 2005, or since 2005, we've had a 30% drop, and that's even greater now because we've had another 3 years. Number of children, 30% down. Number of elders, 26. Number of ministers, 24% down. And a huge number to retire in the next few years because they've reached retirement age. Doug Gay, who's a professor at Glasgow University, wrote a book. He did the Chalmers Lectures last year, and he's written a lot about church. And he said, we declined faster than any other major denomination in the UK. So that's why we need to change. We were not only an institution, but for many, many years we've been closing in. So, we can simply go on. Do you remember this lady? The first one in the Trump White House to talk about alternative facts. Lies is another word for it. You can go on convincing yourself that what you know and what you think is the truth. But actually, the real facts prove that you're wrong. And there are still some people who say, well, we don't need to change. Actually, we're okay. And I understand that if you are in one of those very fortunate congregations when you've got still some young people coming, and you've got 150 or 200 people coming every Sunday, I can understand why in that context you would say, we're okay. But when you look at the wider picture and the wider context of the church, those places are very few and far between. Or maybe you're saying, well, that's all very well, but I can't change at my age. I don't believe that either. So what were some of the problems? Well, I think one of the things that we discovered when we thought about it was that we were running the church rather than making disciples. So many of the things that we do in congregations is about keeping the congregation going, or keeping the organisation of the Church of Scotland going. In places, there are things that should have stopped years ago, but we've kept them running. You know, Mrs. McGlumpha started that, and in her honour, Mrs. McGlumpha died 20 years ago, and it should have gone with her. But we've kept it going because somehow to change and to stop seems like a failure. Of course, you do need to organise things. Of course, you need to prepare and you need to manage an organisation. Of course, you do. But if that's the sole focus that you have, then you are bound for disaster. So Path of Renewal was about changing that focus and about making disciples. That is encouraging and equipping people to learn what it means and also how to put into practice living in a way that honours Jesus. That's what a disciple is. Another problem we found was that we were being people-led rather than spirit-led. And there's two aspects, I think, to that. The first is that it's far too easy for ministers, elders, and leaders to push their own agenda. They were leading and what they wanted and not listening always to what God wanted. Sometimes even using the charisma and natural ability that they had to shape the direction of a congregation. The second is the opposite. Sometimes things are not done because we're frightened. I think sometimes that's true of leaders. We don't do things because we don't want to offend people. But I think there's lots of people in congregations up and down Scotland in every denomination that don't act, don't get involved, don't volunteer, don't respond, don't pray, don't witness, don't do those things because they're frightened of what Mrs. McGlumpha will say about them if they do. Sometimes it's that fear of taking a step of faith that holds us back. And then sometimes we found that we were participating in mission projects without actually having a mission. Kind of gets back to, well, we've always done it that way. But perhaps, what we did in the past isn't right for today or for the future. As a congregation, before even Path of Renewal, we were involved in the discovery process with Tear Fund. And things like the knitting group and coffee buddies came from that work that we did. Because we asked people in the community what was needed and we responded to what we found out. I think that's a very positive and good way of going forward. But we also, for example, stopped the gathering because it wasn't any longer doing what we had hoped it would do. And so we changed it and are now trying to work through times of prayer and praise together. But actually, I think the biggest problem for the Church of Scotland as a denomination is that we were about maintaining rather than renewing. And you go to presbytery, for example, and there's always somebody who wants to keep all the buildings. But we know that practically you can't do that. But there's always somebody who wants to keep all the buildings. It's about maintaining what you know. It's about maintaining what you have. It's about maintaining something of the past. But we spent so much time, energy, and money on maintaining what was there, I think at the expense of generations of people that have not been reached with the gospel because we've put our time and energy and effort into something else. And I do want you to hear this. I'm not saying that there are no good things in the life of the Church of Scotland or in the church in Scotland. There are lots of good initiatives and needs are being met, lives are being changed, the gospel is being proclaimed. But I wonder if it's too little and perhaps even too late for some of our denominations. See, this is only called the Church of Scotland. Actually, we are part of the church of Jesus. And that will never die. The structures of the Church of Scotland may disappear. Really, the Church of Scotland may disappear. The church, because Jesus says it's his church. On Path of Renewal, we thought a bit about that. The ministers went away regularly for some training, and when we shared back with our groups, we read a book. One of the books we read was by a man called Todd Bolsinger, and it was called Canoeing the Mountains. He had a very good image in that book. He used the story of Lewis and Clark, who were sent by President Thomas Jefferson to explore and to find a practical route across the western half of Australia. Because when the Europeans came, they settled along the east coast, because that was closest. In America, indeed. They began to kind of explore and to spread out, Kind of assumed that all of America was the same as what they knew. And so when Lewis and Clark were sent out, they got to a point where they didn't have any maps that were really in any detail. And off they went to find, they hoped, a river that would take them out to the coast on the west. So they went along the Missouri River from the east, and they hoped when they got to the end of that river, they would fairly soon find another one that would take them the other way. No. Even when the Native Americans said, the mountains, quite big mountains, they went, it's okay. But when they got to the mountains, the canoes that they had used, and the canoes they expected to get them to the other side, were of no value. And they had to swap them for horses. All they knew and understood and had hoped for had to change. They had to adapt. And in the West, most church members are actually using an old map, a map of how things used to be. A time when children grew up in the church and they stayed in the church, and they got married in the church, and they had their own children in the church who were baptized in the church, who were married in the church, and they died in the church. And in between somewhere there, they became Sunday school teachers and elders and all that kind of stuff. But then came a generation where the children were born in the church, and they went through Sunday school, and then they went away, and they came back when they got married, and when they had children, they came back and probably stayed because Sunday school was important. And many of them then stayed on and became leaders in congregations. But then there was another generation where the children went away and never came back. That was 2 or maybe 3 generations ago. And if you're using that old map, what you find today is everything is different. Everything has changed. And the church has been really slow to catch up with all of that. There was a time when the church was at the center of the community. And if you look back at landscape paintings, what you find is very often in the middle of this beautiful landscape painting, there's a church on the horizon. Because cathedrals and abbeys were the biggest buildings people had ever seen. So literally when you walked into them, you went, the size of the thing provoked awe. And it was the center of the community. When you get to Lowry and his matchstick men, the church is still there. But it's in the background. Everything else has taken on a different importance. And now, if a congregation is not at the edge of its community, not necessarily physically, but if it's not at the edge, then you're doing well. And it's not, again, that there are not good things happening. There are congregations that are very involved in their communities. But what about us? If we asked ourselves this question, if we closed our doors today, who, apart from ourselves and the groups that use our halls, would notice? Are we really serving our community? Are we really making a difference? Or are we, in fact, doing what we've always done? A number of people in the congregation were involved with the Path of Renewal group locally. And in some ways it's been quite difficult. As I said, it was a pilot process and we didn't really know where we were going or what we were doing. And some of it was literally made up as we went along. When we do things like that in congregations, we usually look for a specific outcome. You know, we're doing a project, so discovery process was expected to end in something tangible that you had to show for having done the process. But that wasn't the case with Path of Renewal. It was about listening to God and learning together, taking opportunities to do things that stretched us, to grow in faith, to support and encourage each other, to read, to pray with and for each other. In essence, it was to learn to be disciples of Jesus, people who learn what Jesus did and go and do the same. Ministers from the congregations that were involved got training, as I said, throughout the year and then came back and shared with their local groups. And what we found was that these local groups benefited from that process, and different congregations have made changes that were appropriate to their own context. However, being part of that pilot process meant that things didn't always work as well as we had hoped or expected. And I think what we discovered when we met together in September was that this last year of the process really hasn't gone the way any of us wanted or had hoped. The folk running the process found that their attention was split because they had started a new group in January. And they got much more influence and attention and time than those of us who were into our third year. But they are learning from our feedback and what we have learned, and that's good. Locally, we did start growing with God groups. I say we're meeting tomorrow night to reflect on how that's going and where we are with that. But as a local group, I think we also felt that loss of impetus and focus because we've not really been meeting together as regularly as we did. So, what have I learnt from all of this? Well, there is a huge surge today across the West in teaching about making and being disciples. There are books and sermons and all sorts of stuff out there on apes. That's the apostles, prophets, and evangelists from our reading today. And the thinking is that over the last 150 years, the church in the West has focused on minister as pastor-teacher. And so we've lost out on those other skills and gifts that God has given. And actually, when you look at parish profiles that come, because when a congregation becomes vacant, they send ministers who've been more than 5 years in a charge their profile in the hope that they might encourage you to move. And when you read them, some of them have this wee bit about the kind of person they're looking for. And they're looking for somebody who's brilliant at everything, who can speak to old people and young people, who can speak to people who have no faith as well as people who have been believers for decades. They're looking for somebody who actually not only is brilliant at everything, but is willing to do everything, to lead everything, to be responsible for everything. I don't know anybody who can actually meet some of those expectations. This passage that we read today tells a different story. It says God gave gifts to his people. And within that, there are some who see the big picture, who can make connections, who can drive things forward, who are willing to take risks and encourage others to take risks. There are some who listen to God and see God at work in the world in ways that others don't, who are not afraid to bring challenge to God's people and to the wider world as they speak words from God. There are some who are able to talk about and to lead others to Jesus in a really natural way. Some who have a real burden for people, not just members, who can support, encourage, and build them up. And there are some who love God's word and can explain it in a way that people not only understand it, but become passionate about it. God has given these people to the church for one specific task: to equip all of his people for works of service. All of his people for works of service. Not some of his people. All of his people. So that the body of Christ may be built up. If we want to build up the church, if we believe it's important, then we need to be equipped. And we need people who have these gifts to bring them and to use them to build each other up. So when our Path of Renewal group met together every 2 weeks, we had done our homework. We held each other to account. We supported and encouraged each other. We spent time listening for God, and our faith grew. And I hope as you see some of these folks around the congregation, you'll realize that and see that in them. But when we started meeting less frequently, it was more difficult to do that. And so if you take that into a congregation where, although we do meet each Sunday, we meet in a large group. We don't really have time to share fully our struggles or our hopes. Support is limited. We don't really spend time waiting on God. Then how do we expect faith to grow? Again, please understand that I believe God does speak in a Sunday service. Of course he does. God has called so many people to serve him. The people are encouraged and strengthened and built up. Of course they are. But it's not always that easy or straightforward. It's much harder for meaningful change to take place in that context if that's all you do each week. And so I believe that the church will continue to decline until God's people get serious about meeting together regularly and specifically to support each other, to encourage each other, and to pray with and for each other so that they're equipped to go and to live for Jesus in the world. If the church is to continue, we have to change in our thinking, our behavior, our practice. And you know, that only happens if we commit to spending time individually and with others in seeking God and allowing him to change us.